We'll have a launch, a peek into the book, what it looks like, and then we'll know more about the book.
Well, thank you for coming. I will just give a brief introduction to the book. And you will pardon me if I have to then go away because I have my own session a little later. And then Swati will talk about the book and handle any questions that you might have. So it's a great pleasure to be speaking about this book. It is a magnificent institutional history of Shantiniketan. Now, I've got to begin with a mischievous remark, uttered a mischievous but profoundly insightful remark made by Ravi Shankar. I mean the greater Ravi Shankar, not the lesser Ravi Shankar. I have in mind the great musician Ravi Shankar. Since you're from Bangalore, I have to make this clarification. He once said that we Bengalis, speaking for himself, we Bengalis have held Rabindranath so close to our hearts that we have not allowed the rest of the world to recognize his greatness. And that's absolutely true. I mean, Bengalis have produced magnificent works of scholarship on Tagore, but those of us who don't live in Bengal, don't live in India, have never had the real chance to understand, appreciate, reflect on Tagore's genius. And this book is one important contribution towards that endeavor. In 1921, Tagore started a university, which became known as Vishwabharati, investing his Nobel Prize funds as well as material he got from elsewhere. And this is an extraordinary and deeply researched history of that university, how it was conceived, how the funds were raised, how it acquired its intellectual and moral vision, how it adopted an international perspective. You know, and I'll just say one last thing so that you know what kind of extraordinary genius Tagore was. Most Indians who are influenced by the wider world, as they should be, are influenced by currents from the West. So Gandhi studied in London. Ambedkar studied in London and in New York. Ramachandra Guha studied in Germany. And part of the Jayaprakash Narayan learned about poverty while working as a sharecropper in California. And this international exposure deeply contributed to their understanding of India's place in the world. The fact that they did not have a parochial, xenophobic vision was fundamental to their evolution and what they contributed to us. But Tagore went a step further than Nehru or Ambedkar or Bose or Gandhi, in that he also looked eastwards. So he had a deep interest in China, in Japan, in Java, in Iran, and all of that is captured and of course Latin America later on, and all of that is captured in the story of how Tagore's University was created, founded, nurtured, and possibly entered later on a period of decline. So I'll give it to Swati now to conduct this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you everybody for coming, and it's been a wonderful day. And the session which I just attended was the NIF Book Prize. And I am an NIF fellow, which is why we've had all the NIF trustees come and formally inaugurate the book. I'm very grateful to Ram for saying these wonderful things about the book, and also very pertinent things about Rabindranath, which we often tend to forget. For many of us, he's just the first Asian to have won the Nobel Prize in 1913, and that his songs became the national anthems. He didn't write national anthems, but became the national anthems of independent India and later independent Bangladesh. But very few people actually reflect on the fact that Rabindranath was probably the foremost public intellectual of his time. He was a thinker, a person who thought deeply not only about India but also about India's connection with the world. And this world, as Ram has pointed out, was not just the West but the East. So the word that he used is Yatra Vishwam Bhavatek Nidam. So where the world makes its home in a single nest. So the ideal of Vishwa Bharati was to bring scholars, artists, scientists from across the world so that they could sort of stay in this very small, fantastic rural settlement called Shantiniketan, which already had a school, which was set up in 1901. But Vishwa Bharati, as a center for learning and culture, was a different venture from the school, which was an ashram school, a brahmacharya. This was an attempt, the Vishwa Bharati was an attempt to connect India with the world, to break what is called the bonds of isolation. And unlike many others, Rabindranath did not talk about colonial modernity. The modernity that he spoke about was also rooted in the Indian tradition. So he had an alternative idea of what constituted the modern, which did not refuse its tradition. As a matter of fact, it took into account the very rich past of India, its religious past. And religious, by religious I don't mean institutional religion, but he spoke about Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, Islam and Christianity as containing the knowledge base of India. So in the Vishwa Bharati lectures, which contain the kernel of the idea of this institution, which was not thought of as a university in the standard sense, but as a center of learning and culture, he focused on three areas. One was Oriental studies, which involved the study of Buddhism, Jainism, and with it the study of languages. So the religions as they resided now in China or in Japan later on, but also Hinduism in its early form, and Islam and Zoroastrianism and Christianity, and with it the languages which were involved. So Pali, Prakrit, Sanskrit, Chinese, Japanese, Persian, and all of this. A center for art, which is now Kala Bhavan, which involved both visual arts as well as music, and music later separated. Music and performing arts, both of them. And finally, a center for rural reconstruction. So I don't think there is any university then or now which has imagined itself along these three kind of axes. So it was not thinking about just teaching, but about research, about dissemination of knowledge, not only dissemination of knowledge, but the production of knowledge, which is research, right? So this is how Rabindranath thought of Vishwa Bharati. So semi-autonomous centers which were connected to a larger ideal, to a unifying ideal, which is called Vishwa Bharati, the world center of learning. And the important thing is that, Orientalism always existed. So what is unique about Rabindranath's venture? What is unique about Rabindranath's venture is that he's suggesting that scholars from the West, European scholars, work with India. So not independently forming a kind of biased understanding of India or the Orient, but working with scholars in India, Vidushekar Shastri, Kirti Mohan Sen, the Bhandarkar institution. So to work with them, to work in collaboration. So Rabindranath is thinking about a collaboration of minds. He's thinking not only of a center of learning, but an alternative community, a world, right? Why is he thinking like this? Because he has just experienced, he's a very sensitive man who has thought about the world. So this is just after the World War, the First World War. And he thinks of this as a war which has happened, a war of nations, which has happened because of deep division, of the coming together of capitalism and colonialism. So that's like a poison, he says, which is vitiating the world. So we need an antidote to this. What is the antidote? Of having people coming together. What is amazing is that he thinks that a small settlement in rural Bengal can become this site. And people come. So what is really amazing is that there are people, very important scholars like Sylvain Lévy, who is one of the greatest French Orientalists, or Maurice Wintonetz, who did very fantastic collaborative work of the Mahabharata. He's one of the first persons to sort of bring together many versions of the Mahabharata, a collation. Most of them were linguists. There's Giuseppe Tucci and Formicki, who were actually funded by none other than the great fascist, the Italian fascist. So Mussolini. So Rabindranath apparently admired Mussolini, but I think it was partially not because of anything else except that this was funding which was happening. When he came to know about what Mussolini was, of course, he completely came out in the open and denigrated him. So I think Rabindranath's venture is also a critique of authority, of power, of various systems which have abused knowledges of systems which have created division amongst people. So I think it is a venture which is not just a university. It is a kind of attempt to create an alternative way of living. Why did I do this work? Why NIF chose this is a question which only NIF trustees can answer. But I think the point was that this was also thought of as a beginning or one of the very important moments of modern India, of the beginning of modernity in India. So Nehru was influenced very much by Rabindranath's understanding of this university. Chinese studies, for example, and China. So Nehru took a special interest in the India-China relationship. And outside of the political, this was one of the fields that he was focusing on, that he was thinking about. Nandalal Bose, who became the chief architect of Gandhi's Congress sessions, of all these fantastic pavilions that he made, came from Shantiniketan. So Rabindranath had an influence on some of the most important political thinkers of his time, and just not political thinkers, I think people who were trying to build the modern India. So the making of modern India is something that is happening also, I would suggest, in Vishwabharati. So when I began this work, it was supposed to be a history of 1951 to 1961. But as the work began, I moved backwards, because unless and until I spoke about the origin, one would not know what is happening in 51 when it becomes a central university. So it is the people of Vishwabharati who think of it as a crisis. And the crisis is caused not only by the death of Rabindranath in 1941, but also, I would say, by the death of Gandhi. Because Gandhi is the person that Rabindranath gives this institution to. He says, this is my life's best treasure. I want you to protect it. And Gandhi does. He keeps coming to Shantiniketan. He is the person that people in Shantiniketan turn to. And I think with his Gandhi's death, this is my hypothesis, there is a kind of knee-jerk reaction. There is a sense that, everything is now failing. Gurudev has gone, Gurudev meaning Rabindranath, and Mahatma has also gone. So who is going to take care of this institution? Why is this a crisis? Because they're not taking money from the government. There is no government funding. The British cannot obviously be the people that Rabindranath is thinking of. So where is he taking the funding from? From the Maharajas, from the Nawabs, from the businessmen of India. So the Tatas, the Birlas, the Goenkas are funding Vishwabharati. It's a fantastic instance of funding which is coming from these institutions, from these houses, but it is thought of as a public institution. It's not a private institution. Public, why? Because people can participate in the making of Vishwabharati. You can become a member. So you pay maybe 5 rupees and 10 rupees and you become a member of the society called Vishwabharati. So this is thought of as a society. It's not an institution in the sense that we understand it. And this society has the school, it has the Center of Oriental Studies, it has Kala Bhavan, the Center of Arts, and it also has a Rural Reconstruction Center. And it is this idea which I don't think anybody understands, even in independent India. Right, so they have an idea of the university, which is a British model, or maybe a European model. So the fact that it is, Rabindranath is thinking about it as a center for research is not something that people understand. So they turn it into a standard university. And that, I think, is the source of the real crisis that's happening. The uniqueness of this institution is not maintained. But I would argue that as long as Nehru is there, there is an attempt to understand the uniqueness of this university. But you see, bureaucracy has a system. So if you become a central university, you're already sort of moving into bureaucracy. So you can't do anything. There is the Ministry of Education which will step in. They will say that you have to have exams this way. They will say there is going to be a system of appointment. So Rabindranath, tries to appoint people in the tradition that Rabindranath had from the West as well as from the East. So they say, no, we just want Indians in this system. So gradually, I think it becomes, I don't want to comment on what has happened now. You read newspapers, you would know. But I think the decline happens because it's a systemic failure. It's a systemic failure of the public institutions of our country. It's part of that. But I think it remains, even now, a very interesting place in terms of the way in which traces of the original idea linger. It lingers in the idea of the community, it lingers in the idea of the school, and it also lingers mostly, the idea of internationalism stays on in Kala Bhavan, the Center for Visual Arts, for Performance Arts. So we have students actually coming from all over the world. So I think some of this is, I trace some of this in this book. It's roughly 2 sections. The first section is a kind of chronology from 21 to 61, also the crises which are happening. The second section is about the 3 centers of learning: Oriental Studies, Kala Bhavan, and Rural Reconstruction, which is Sriniketan, which is not Shantiniketan. So there are twin centers, Shantiniketan and Sriniketan. And the experiment in Sriniketan is absolutely amazing, because Rabindranath is thinking about bringing villages together as part of the cooperative, right? And he's not thinking of a top-down system, but a system which will emerge from within. So I don't think people have been thinking about this, or thinking about the problems of economy in terms of independence of villages in the way that Rabindranath was. So it's difficult to talk about a 500-page book in 10 minutes. So it would be lovely that if you read this book. It's available, I think, on the Amazon. I don't know whether bookstores in Bangalore have it. They do? Okay. So I would love to have responses about this, because this is just not an institutional history, but a history of modern India, I would say. So that's all I have to say. If there are any queries, any responses, I'd love to respond to that.
And it was very heartening to hear, because my mother was from Vishwabharati. Yeah.
She studied?
She studied classical music.
I see. So there you are.
Yeah. So it feels very intimate to talk about something which has been a part of my family too. But the question that I'm going to ask you today is that do you think, what are your opinions on, Vishwabharati, I would rather say Vishwabharati. Vishwabharati is not only an institution made out of cement and stone, but it is also an idea, it's also a case study, it's a model. And today when we read about Rabindranath, we also know that there is a school in Brazil which has been named after him, and how they are adopting Rabindranath's ideas of open schooling, which is again interesting because he did not have an institutionalized education himself. So how do you think that today, in today's situation where it is so important that we encourage young generation to think outside the box, the idea of Vishwabharati is being sort of internalized in today's education structures?
We know about the open air school, so they sit under the trees. That's the only thing people know. But sitting under the trees, and you may read Amrita Sen's fantastic sort of autobiography on this. It is also about getting out of these sort of neat boxes into which we think that young people can be put. So the possibility of opening up borders of or not having borders, so a borderless, boundless classroom. Right? Not a room, but a class system. But more importantly, I would say that Rabindranath, and I'm not discounting the school at all, but I'm saying Vishwabharati as an idea. And Rabindranath said this. He said that it doesn't have to be limited to Shantiniketan and Sriniketan. It's an idea that can be taken anywhere. So the idea of Vishwabharati, many Vishwabharatis, So you could have many centers like this. So it is up to the people to, take this up. So it's happened in Brazil. I understand that they are thinking about this in the US. Harvard and has definitely case studies of Vishwabharati, which I've heard of. So I think what we need to probably think is a model, a very interesting model of decentralization that Rabindranath had thought of. So autonomous centers. So you had Bidhushekar Babu doing Oriental studies, Nandalal Babu in charge of Kala Bhavan. So Rabindranath himself taking charge of Shongit Bhavan. And the rural reconstruction was done by Leonard Elmhurst and Rothindranath. So there were people who were working partially independently, but also in tandem with the larger idea. I think this is a fantastic thing that we can take from the idea of Vishwabharati. Right? Not the institution as it is, or as it became. This was an idea which was very difficult, I think, also to execute. But I don't think it's impossible. We can probably do that, yes. Thank you very much for your question, and lovely to know that your mother is
here's another question.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Talk about the uniqueness of Vishwabharati. I mean, why would you say it is that it is so unique? Particularly in those early decades. Was it because it's so contingent on the group of people that established it? Because 100 years on, although you're talking about the influence, there is not another per se. So, what's the reason for that uniqueness? Would you say?
Think about Prashanto Moholanobish, who was the first statistician that we have. Right? He becomes part of Nehru's cabinet. He is this first one of the joint secretaries of Vishwabharati. He's a man from Cambridge who studied physics. He comes in and he becomes part of this educational venture, which is also a venture of culture. So I think you're absolutely right in thinking that around Rabindranath, these group of people have come in. Right? Kiti Mohan Sen, who's unfortunately known only as Amartya Sen's grandfather, is probably one of the first scholars who's talking about Hinduism as a syncretic tradition. So much of what Amartya actually says now is so much what his grandfather had said and what Rabindranath has been thinking about. His idea of economics is also taken so much from the rural reconstruction that Rabindranath has been thinking about. So yes, the people. Leonard Elmhurst keeps coming back. Okay, so till the 50s, the history that I have sort of researched, well into the 60s, Elmhurst is part of this institution, though he has left formally. So he keeps coming back. So I think it is very much contingent upon the very talented people willing to dedicate themselves to an idea, which makes this place. There's just one comment which might sort of help in this. So when this is debated in the parliament, becomes a parliament debate, a bill is passed. C.D. Deshmukh, who is one of the very important architects of modern India, says that, I'm afraid that they'll turn it into a mediocre place of degree-walas. So once you start paying money, it will not be people who are coming for the idea, but people who are coming for a central university job. And that's what it becomes. Deshmukh doesn't want it to be a university. He says, give them money, but let them retain their independence and autonomy. It may have worked. We don't know. It's a speculative question. But Deshmukh is probably the only person who understands Rabindranath's idea. So it's not a Bengali thing at all. Rabindranath was not, in that sense, what we would understand as Bengali. It's sad that Bengalis have just completely appropriated him. He belongs to India and he's belonged to the world always. He never thought of his identity as only a Bengali. He wrote in Bengali. He wrote in Bangla. But his ideas were of the world and for the world. So he didn't like the word international. He said it's a brotherhood of hooligans. And cosmopolitan, he said, is bloodless. But what do we have? So we have worlding. So to be in the world, that is what we need to think of. The idea as well as a grounding in the real. So I think that it hasn't happened because we haven't responded to Rabindranath. We failed him in many ways.
Thank you.
Talk. Rabindranath Tagore was a mystical poet and a brilliant mystical poet. And most of mystical poets, including J. Krishnamurti, who was a mystic philosopher, delve in the realm of the mind. And it's not everybody's cup of tea to be dealing with Platonic ideals in the realm of the mind. How much would you categorize Vishwa Bharati as an elitist school apart from the norm?
It wasn't an elitist school at all. Tuition were all people who were peasants, people who were craftsmen, who were coming from the local area. Most people who came to Vishwa Bharati could have been from affluent families, but I don't think their thinking was elitist. The lives that they led in Vishwa Bharati was one of hardship. It was impossible to be an elite. Rabindranath was probably the only elite in this entire institution. He came from a zamindar family. But I think his ability to also get away from his privileges, from what he had, is amazing. I'll just end with one instance. The Nobel Prize money was not actually given to the school. It was given to agricultural banks in Kaligram and Potishar for the peasants of his zamindari. Well, how did the school benefit from it? They got the interest from this investment. When this failed, Rabindranath said, let the money go, but I will not invest it in other banks. So this was not a man who was elite. He was thinking about the people.
Thank you.
I
think you can continue the conversation.
Yes.
Swati Ganguly, it was so wonderful. I don't have words.
Thank you.
And sessions like these really make us fall in love with books all over again. You have to go with Swati to the ballroom, pick a copy, chat with her, and get a copy signed by her, and continue the wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been lovely talking to you.